Self.
Great. Well, a very good evening to you. I'm sorry about the delay. Quite extraordinary. My name is Nigel Rawlinson, and I met Eyob, our speaker, yesterday. We did a dry run last night, and then, would you believe it, for the first time, Eyob was stuck in traffic, and we then had technical issues. I'm sorry about the wait, but welcome to this event tonight. It's the second in this festival, Freedom in the City, linked with Emperor Haile Selassie, of course, who came to live in the city and Fairfield House, now used by the Rastafarian Ethiopian and Afro-Caribbean community. My name is Nigel Rawlinson. I'm the Associate Minister at Bath Abbey. The Abbey is honoured to be hosting this event. The Abbey is built on a place of worship for at least 2,000 years, and there's been a Christian church at the Abbey for about 1,300 years. It is an amazing building, and some history just to link us tonight is that the floor of the Abbey has just been restored. It was collapsing. The Abbey is built 4 meters above the Roman baths, and indeed, I've got a picture here. I don't know if you can see on my screen, but this is a picture of the Roman baths and the Abbey in the background. You can see where the Abbey is in relation to the Roman baths. And Haile Selassie visited the Roman baths back in 1954. And so, and he stood there, right where my finger is. He stood on the Great Bath there. There's a photograph of him, and you can imagine that the work that has been fascinating. They've used some water from the hot springs, channeled up to underfloor heating, and so there's a history link here with tonight. Now, the city and Rome history is 2,000 years. Tonight, we are going to hear about another culture and civilization with an even longer history. And it's wonderful for me to be able to welcome our speaker, Eyob Derrillo. He is curator at the Ethiopian collection at the British Library. He's recently done a demonstration on African Scribes, Manuscript Culture of Ethiopia. And tonight, as you see, he's going to give us a talk on the representations of St. George in Ethiopian art and culture. St. George, the patron saint of England, of course, died in 303 and became linked to our country because the soldiers in the First Crusade believed that he was fighting for them. We will hear more about that from Eyob, plus I think 1 or 2 corrections on images as well. So it's a great pleasure for me now to hand over to Eyob. And just to say, please post your questions. There'll be guidance in the chat. After Eyob has spoken, we will be delighted to answer some questions. So a warm welcome. And I'm also going to start off with a very simple prayer for us all tonight, linking us together. I'll just say this prayer before I hand over to Eyob. Almighty Father God, thank you for bringing us all together. Thank you that we can be united in our separate rooms by your Holy Spirit. So we are all together tonight to learn and to grow in our faith. So please bless this evening, dear Lord. Amen. Right, Eyob, over to you. Great to welcome you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Reverend. Again, I also apologize for the delay. So today, my talk really is focused on the St. George items or manuscript collection in the British Library. It's a huge collection, so I try to be as succinct as possible. And I've literally had St. George on my mind for a while to publish something on this important figure in Ethiopian history and culture. Perhaps I need to sort of start really early. As of everything, the perception of Ethiopia is rather complex. Since the 17th century, Western historians have tried to grapple with the unique character of Ethiopian art and tradition, which is, as most of you know, it's very complex. So they still are and are arguing that Ethiopian culture's uniqueness owes owes specifically to outside of influence, particularly the Middle East and Greek civilization. While of course there is a close relation within that culture, especially around the sort of the Judeo-Christian element, but they always overlook sort of the obvious cultures surrounding Africa, and there is strong evidence of intermingling with Egypt, Nubia, Syriac, and other places. And in my talk here specifically, what you will see is sort of the uniqueness of Ethiopian view of history and art from its own perspective. Perhaps I start with obviously the earliest sort of Western understanding of Ethiopia geographically. It could be traced to Herodotus' account, which, interestingly enough, well, it's not really accurate, but interestingly enough, he does describe the Nile and its sort of the power within that area. But more specific history of Ethiopia is traced archaeologically to the rise of the Aksum Empire, a very powerful maritime kingdom that was located in the north of Africa today, Eritrea, Somalia, Eritrea and Tigray. It was a very powerful trade which had strong link across the globe. So in terms of the language, the Afroasiatic population were found in that region. Afroasiatic, meaning the Semitic speakers, as early as the 7th century BCE. And the most important point in Aksum is also before 270 AD, there was minting of coin, which again testifies to trade. So here I'm just pointing out sort of the global connection of that world. Perhaps the most important leader at the time of king is Izana, who we know converted to Christianity in 330 AD. But that doesn't justify it as being the day that Christianity arrived. There is this assumption in Western academia that because it's 330 AD is when the coin was minted, therefore Christianity came then. So it's not the main point. So within 615, obviously the arrival of Islam and Islam's connection with Ethiopia historically has been great. Then we get to the so-called 1800 periods where historians argue sort of the decline of Aksum. This is just a background to just contextualize the sort of how exposed Ethiopia was at the time. As most of you are probably familiar, Ethiopia is located in East Africa, Horn of Africa, bordered with Somalia, Kenya, and Sudan on the west. So we begin, perhaps, as I stated earlier on, that Christianity in Ethiopia is traced to 333 AD. But historical documents and also historical account of the tradition of the church, the roots go back to as far as the 1st century AD, with the baptism of the eunuch, which is cited in the book of the Acts, where he's converted by Philip. And we get many assumption that this eunuch probably would have been a Jew. So Ethiopia's link to Christianity is testified in the New Testament. And going back to my previous point with the geographical location of Ethiopia, we also have to think Ethiopia not just in its modern sort of geographical boundary. We have to sort of take our head out of the idea of borders as we see them now. So St. George, for some of you, please do not be surprised. He's not British. He's from he's from Turkey, who lived in the 3rd century, as the Reverend has pointed out at the start. And his mother was a Christian from the city of Lod in Palestine, which today is near Tel Aviv. This is the location of this place. He is one of the most venerated saints martyrs in Ethiopia. In terms of he's considered as one of in fact, the great martyr, and he is frequently given the title in Ethiopia as Liqa Sama'atat, leaders of the martyr, as earning an important place in that. And of course, the other aspect of St. George is his bravery. As you will see in his iconography, he's depicted as a soldier. Yes, his father was in the service of the Roman soldier, and he himself was a Roman soldier. But in art, St. George occupies a really important position in Ethiopian iconography. He is presented in manuscripts, church mural decoration, wall paintings, wooden, more frequent than any other saint, except for the Virgin Mary. Indeed, the image of St. George is often associated with the Virgin Mary in Ethiopian iconography, interestingly enough, which I will show more example. So the purpose of this talk is not really to trace when this tradition began. In virtually all church decoration from the 17th century onwards, St. George occupies a prominent position. But perhaps the earliest example of St. George is in the church of Lalibela, who was one of the important kings of Ethiopia from the Zagwe dynasty, which ruled after the collapse of the end of the Aksum Empire. He is also known, as some of you who's been to Ethiopia, who built this beautiful monolithic churches, which one church is dedicated to St. George. But perhaps more interestingly is the carving on the wall in Golgotha, in one of the early churches, that we see the depiction of St. George standing, holding a cross in his hand and a book. Interestingly enough, St. George is the patron saint of quite a lot of country, but in the case of Lalibela, it seems that St. George was adopted earlier, perhaps earlier than most other churches, because there is an early depiction of him in the Golgotha church. Shortly after Lalibela completed the construction of the monolithic churches, the last church he built was dedicated for St. George. And according to the hagiography and the Acts of King Lalibela, the story goes that God and St. George appeared to Lalibela and asked him why he has forgotten to build a church dedicated to St. George. So the king has already established that he is the patron saint of Ethiopia, of his kingdom. And he builds him one of the most beautiful monolithic churches in the Lalibela complex, which resembles the cross. Very fascinating in terms of architecture. But again, the king sort of expresses his reverence to St. George. There are also other paintings within the church itself. There are other later paintings of St. George, the typical one being the famous iconography of St. George sat on the horse slaying the dragon. Going back to my early point, these are some examples of St. George always occupying a left side, sometimes the right-hand side, and Mary in between the icons. And this tradition somehow dates to the earliest example we have is from the 15th century. It continues of having these two important figures, religious figures in Ethiopian art. In terms of how that developed, there are some articles which I could email you on. But my focus today is really on the material found in the British Library, more specifically in manuscript and the printed illustration of St. George. So the British Library, for some of you who are not familiar with it, it's the National Library of the United Kingdom. It was traditionally part of the British Museum until 1973, where Act of Parliament created a separate National Library. So the Ethiopian collection within the British Library is found in different sections, from maps to sound recording of the Emperor Menelik's message to Victoria, to the philatelic collection, where there are some examples of early stamps from Ethiopia and, of course, Somalia and many other regions. So it is rich. However, the main focus has always been around the manuscripts, which have been in the libraries, have been in the British Library, British Museum prior to, since the 1720s onward. The first collection was donated to the library by Harley, who was part of the who was the owner of many manuscripts in Latin as well as in Hebrew. In his possession, he had 2 Ethiopian manuscripts that were given to the British Museum then. Then the second large collection of 74 codexes of manuscripts came into the library around 1830, which were collected by Eisenberg Kraft, which some of you who are familiar with the history of missionary would know, who was a German missionary who went to Ethiopia. He spent a great deal of time in Ethiopia, who also translated the gospel into Orominya, written in the Ethiopic script. So he comes back to the library with 74 codexes that he acquired in different means. Mostly they were gift. So these codexes or these manuscripts were not really luxurious as such. They were small books that were owned by priests, so they were given to him by different individuals. We do get that explanation in his book, in his diary, which was published. So the largest single acquisition of manuscript happened in 1868 at the Battle of Magdala, where the British troop sent their troops in this so-called punitive expedition against Emperor Theodore. And after the defeat of Emperor Theodore, around 500 manuscripts fell in the hands of the British. We know 500 left. The Emperor Tewodros then was building a library, a church endowment for the church he just built, called Madani, the Savior of the World. And he collected around 1,900 manuscripts. We know this for sure. Out of the 900 or so, 500 left Ethiopia. 350 were taken by the British Museum then. All of these manuscripts were auctioned on the site. So technically, not just the manuscripts, many other important religious items were also looted. But the 350 now in the British Museum were 350. Then one was returned in 1870s by the request of Queen Victoria, because King Johannes specifically asked for one of the manuscripts to be returned. So now we have in the possession of 349 manuscripts. They are luxurious manuscripts. They are royal manuscripts, heavily illustrated. They contain almost every aspect of Ethiopian literature, from government document to magic, medicine, of course, all the biblical text. Since our focus is on St. George, for the purpose of this talk, I have been sort of noting what interesting items related to St. George that is in the collection. Perhaps I'll begin with the earliest example, which is a collection of acts of martyrs and homilies to various early martyrs. And in this manuscript, there is a specific section on St. George. This manuscript was produced in the 13th century, and it was commissioned by the son of Yukona Amlak, who was the founder of the Solomonic dynasty, who took over after the Zagwe kingdom. So it's very interesting to note that that his son Yigabazion commissions this manuscript, and of course it's it has many other collection, but it's also dedicated to Saint George. So this reverence of Saint George continues. It's written in this beautiful script, in the Ethiopic Ge'ez script, but this script is also known as the early magistic Ethiopian script. So the early example, in fact, of Ethiopian manuscript in the British Library is this manuscript dating from the 13th century. And other important examples of paintings that's also early is this painting from OR 516, a 17th century illustration of St. George from the Four Gospels. This manuscript in particular is important because it's attributed to a very important Ethiopian artist from the region of, interestingly enough, Lalibela, Lasta region. He apparently founded an art school as well. There are 5 manuscripts of his in existence that we know. One is in a private collection. The other one is in the Metropolitan Museum, one at the British Library, and another 2, I think, in Ethiopia, in Lalibela region. This artist in particular is unique in his style because he's very much influenced with sort of secular art, where, in a sense that his style of painting is unique, and it is actually closely related to talismanic art, which which you can see from the way he draws the line. And before Picasso, you had somebody who was actually experimenting with lines. Of course, the earliest legend of St. George and the dragon, according to historians, is recorded in 11th century Georgian source. So going back to that iconography, I will come back to the dragon story. Going back to the iconography tradition of having Mary and George, this continues again within also the manuscript tradition, where the first 2 folios usually would have St. George on the left-hand side and always Mary on the right-hand side. So that continues. This example here from the Miracles of Mary is also interesting in that it's the request of the patrons who are asking this specifically because like icon, there is that devotion. So when they're having a manuscript commissioned on the life of Jesus, they want this iconography of Mary and St. George. So that continues to this day, which you can also buy these icons in Addis Ababa where they make it. So the story of the dragon is perhaps what St. George is known for. In the Ethiopian account, the dragon is really is described as a python, a large python that spits out blood spits out poison, and can fly. So, as you can see in the second painting, there is a great faith to the text where the artist is actually trying to depict a large serpent with 2 small wings, whereas with the other 2 we have the typical dragon that we see in most Western art. But then the story in the Ethiopian text is also different. St. George doesn't sit on the dragon and kill it. He actually parades the dragon around the city of Beirut. There was a strong cult associated with this dragon. Again, this points to the early serpent worship that has existed everywhere, even in Ethiopia before the time of King Solomon, where we have an account of the mother of the Queen of Sheba, her ancestor were worshippers of the snake. So the artist in Ethiopia, the early art, as you can see, is close to the snake, but then there is a great influence, of course, during the Gondar period, where there were exchange of ideas, artists coming in from Europe, artists traveling in Ethiopia. So we get that iconography being more close to what every Orthodox church or Christian church associates with St. George of the Horse. And of course, in Gondar, the art really begins to change. The depiction, the style. We have St. George here was depicted as an Ethiopian noble warrior, it's very frequent. This dragon depiction again is found in other European accounts, and specifically that dragon with a short tail is described as being the Ethiopian dragon, and this is found in a early printed book of an Italian, actually, natural historian who wrote a very important book titled The History of Snakes and Dragons, but mostly serpents. So it's interesting how this myth, sometimes when you try to trace it just to one place in Europe, you also find that myth sort of circling around. So he is a warrior saint. And this term is used to describe the early martyrs, amongst them Gladius. I'm just using two examples here. St. George has always been associated with the white horse in Ethiopian iconography, whereas Gladius and the other Saint Margorios with black and brown horse. And here even Saint Fasilides also had a white horse, but is covered in a different color of horse dressing to sort of not get the iconography confused. So the warrior saints have always been symbolic in terms of the war and the king and the kingship or leadership. But the most important aspect of St. George is his martyrdom, where he suffered for 7 years of different excruciation, painful torture during the Diocletian persecution in Italy. So the hagiography of St. George really is the time he spends, that 7 years of experiencing different kinds of torture, as you can see in this painting, beautifully painted, of course, a very grim and sad illustration. So in this manuscript of St. George, OR 714, there is quite a lot of depiction of his martyrdom, and again in the iconography, St. George is always painted as a young soldier who was actually 17 years old at the time, and those doing the torturing, as you can see in this painting, are always painted side profile, and this is an art style that develops in Gondar in the 17th century. So he goes through many tortures, and I'll just show you some example here. The king Dudunios, who was really frustrated by St. George, he keeps devising different types of torture method, but St. George keeps coming back to life. And you can see there where Christ appears and he instructs St. Michael to actually bring St. George back together. And you can see the saint, the angel bringing St. George back together. And more example, he's put through to the fire, he's put through the spike. But towards the end, the last sort of torture, his last death, he dies and he is put into, his head is accepted there by St. Michael, who takes his head and he has a final rest. So his martyrdom, or as we say, Gadol in Ethiopia, is finalized, and he is in heaven canonized and crowned as the martyr. So the text usually follows this specific guide where they begin with St. George the dragon, and then they go into his martyrdom, and then afterward his death. On the far left, you can see the patrons of that manuscript who are painted sort of diagonal, and this is a way of showing the respect. By the way, all the images that I'm showing you have already been digitized, and they're available on the British Library website. So after his death, the texts always focus on the miracles of St. George. So he's invoked more and more, and he appears again here where he is where he intercedes to help a poor fisherman whose fish was taken away from him. So again, in the miracles, you see him again as a soldier. This time he's always with his horse, and as most of you will be familiar with Ethiopian culture, horse plays an important role in Ethiopian culture since the Aksumite period. And also you find St. George in other texts that outside of his hagiography, and one in particular is the Miracles of Mary, where Mary actually rescues St. George again from being bound in prison. He's rescued with a dove who comes in and takes him out of the jail that he was in. And of course, this is another Gondaring period of art, which is beautifully illustrated, another British Library example of illuminated manuscript. And of course, St. George is also found in other texts. In particular, there is one text which I wasn't able to share with you guys because I haven't photographed it, but in the incantation, where he's invoked in time of conflict, and particularly there's a specific text titled Melka Georgis, which deals with an incantation to invoke his name. But this particular manuscript, which was commissioned by a noble person, and it was contained in a very beautiful silver case, has St. George depicted here battling against a demon, as you can see on the left-hand side. And also the other martyr saints, warrior saints are also illustrated. But beneath that text, beneath the illustration, in this case sometimes it's described as talisman because it has also a protective element, we see the incantation at the bottom. Of course, it's also a salutation to St. George and asking St. George for protection. So we see that tradition continuing in scrolls and as well as in manuscript. Perhaps the less known example is the 17th miracle of St. George, which is attributed to the Battle of Adwa, in which Ethiopia decisively wins a war against invading Italian forces in 1896. So a miracle was added because, according to the miracle at the time, it was the war was on St. George's Day, as we know, the 1st of March, and King Minilik, who was another devoted servant of St. George, took a replica of the tablet, the Ark of the Covenant, during the war. It was a war that was, predicted that Ethiopia would lose. It was standing against the most modern army at the time. And many did invoke St. George. The miracle that was added to the hagiography of St. George states that St. George was amongst the Ethiopians fighting with Minilik. Interestingly enough, it doesn't talk about just the victory, but it talks about how it was the faith that allowed Ethiopians to defeat the Italians. And rightly, Minilik and the church then adds this miracle to the hagiography of St. George. The process of adding something like that, it had to be obviously approved by the church fathers. So we don't have the original text that Minilik incorporated this miracle, but we do have a print version which was first printed in 1968 and then again reprinted in 1990. So I just wanted to share that example of sort of the continuous of the importance of St. George. Of course, after the Battle of Adwa, many key influences, what we can say also modern art in Ethiopia from 1897, 96 onward, we see Ethiopian modern artists being influenced by traditional art, but this time they incorporate sort of modern element. Again, storytelling is a very important aspect of the Ethiopian tradition, and here artists are trying to preserve that glorious victory against the Italians. And in the middle of the painting, St. George is depicted. And this item is not in a British Library, it's in the British Museum. It is a painting, oil painting on a cloth, which was acquired in 1974 by the British Museum. We see St. George in the middle, ringed around the Ethiopian flag, the green, yellow, red. And on the left-hand side, right-hand side, we see the Italian soldiers all painted inside profile. And again, this is going back to the Gondar period, where we're indicating that the baddies are always given only side profile. And we see Minilik right far, top corner, under an umbrella giving order, and then his wife Aitu leading. So this kind of art is very common now in Ethiopia. So the continuation of St. George, the influence he exerts in Ethiopia is still evident. And in my talk, I tried as much as I can, as briefly as I can, to go through this beautiful tradition. Thank you very much. So I hand you over back to Nigel, Reverend Nigel.
Well, thank you so much indeed. It was great to see those pictures properly. You saw them last night, briefly, didn't we, as we went through it? But fascinating, and it's always great to listen to somebody drawing on a huge wealth of knowledge. So thank you so much. Now we have got a couple of questions here. I'd like to ask one first, though. Really, we talked a bit about it yesterday. And thank you for saying, where the material came from. But I imagine some of the material in the British Library, was acquired by, not underhand means, but well,
they were looted.
Tell us about that. Could you? I mean, there must be some complexities now with all the stuff that you're going through.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is a historical fact, and the first catalogue produced for the Magdala manuscript actually gives the description of the war and how this important collection fell into the hand of the British soldiers accidentally. And then the British Museum then was the only one who was able to have this auction. So loot has its own history. In many cultures. So Ethiopia is not unique in that. So perhaps what's interesting about the Magdala case is that manuscripts weren't the only item. There were also other important sacred church items that were taken. For example, the Tabot, which is a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, was also taken. And these are items in the British Museum which cannot be displayed. So, they need to be...
Yeah, I'd imagine the importance of your work, though, fascinating, is actually to inform the decision makers about what can be returned and that sort of thing. Is that right?
So my job as a curator, first and foremost, is working with the collection and making the collection accessible. Yeah. So the debate on restitution on Ethiopia, I have kind of written mentioning it in an article. It's a live one. There is request for the items to be returned by the Ethiopian government, but my work has focused so much on the access of this material. Despite having this case, people do not have access to this item. We've now at the library, we've digitized 300 manuscripts. So again, we're trying to engage with, I'm trying to engage more with the collection, make the collection more accessible. But the debate on restitution will always rage above curatorial or historians.
The important, in fact, that leads it really well into the first question we have here, where somebody's written in saying, can we visit the British Library to see the collection? So that's the first question to you.
So yes, the library, one can visit. Of course, given now we are in this lockdown, you need to book your slots in the reading room. So the manuscripts are accessible. For this, you can go on the British Library website. There is a comprehensive guide, so the items can be viewed and should be viewed. So they're there to be accessed.
Great. Okay, so the second question here is, how is St. George's Day celebrated and observed in Ethiopia?
So that's a good question. So usually the since during the Battle of Adwa, since that's the most important day for a lot of Ethiopians, of course that period is remembered, and Battle Adwa sometimes is reenacted. But for those who are devout Christians and very serious, like my family, who were also committed to very much to Saint George, obviously the day begins with going to the church service and coming home and doing what we call the zikr, which is offering. You cut the bread and you have wine. Some families who are highly dedicated will throw a feast. Not Adbar, sorry, I shouldn't say Adbar. Adbar is something else. Would throw a feast and invite the neighbors for eating. So, and then there is the St. George beer, who has been to Ethiopia. Now, one of the most popular beers called St. George, and the one of the best Ethiopian football teams also called St. George. So St. George is, he's incredibly important. But it's also knowing that there isn't a very good comprehensive book on St. George and Ethiopia, like covering all aspects of culture.
Well, this is an obviously guided conversation, because the third question is, do you have any book recommendations for anyone interested in learning more about this topic?
I did have some. I did have some book. Unfortunately, I cannot remember the author's name. There are a couple of interesting books, but I will honestly recommend books in Amharic if you can read. Whereas with the English books, I cannot recommend much. But if you can email me, I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I'm happy to. I have loads of bibliography, but now I cannot think of anyone off the top of my head.
I mean, just on that, would that be all right if the organisers if people contacted you at the festival to get your email? Would that be all right if they wanted to?
Yes, sure. Yeah, in fact, even if people, all the images that I've shown are available on the website, so I could also send shelf marks of this material. Yeah.
Right. That's very good. I would love to hear. Oh, one more question to come in. Hang on a minute. Let's look at this here. Yes, okay. Yes, very good. So this has just arrived. Thank you for a wonderful talk. Might you be able to talk to the relationship between the Ethiopian and Coptic iconography and the depictions of saints therein? I'll just read that to you again. Might you be able to talk to the relationship between Ethiopian and Coptic iconography and the depictions of saints therein?
So there's a close relationship between the Orthodox Christian churches in terms of their iconographical tradition. So this is why I wanted to emphasize on the point that lazy scholars have always talked about influence, and whenever we talk about influence, we end up in the circle where we say A influenced B and B. So we end up in the circle where we don't really get the full story of how that iconographical tradition began. You do have exactly similar representation in the Coptic Church of St. George, again, St. George on the horse slaying the dragon. There are, of course, different elements in terms of in Ethiopian art. The focus is always on the eye, the expression, not so much background. As you've seen, a lot of those paintings, there are no background because they follow an iconographical tradition where the subject is always important. So there is this opinion I'm giving is obviously from my view, not so much that there's been any research on the comparison of the two. But historically, the two have had a great link. So sometimes tracing the root of how an iconography tradition started is not easy, because that tradition then will take us to the Egyptian, and of course we know that the early depiction of a warrior slaying a python or a snake is found also in pagan elements. So to answer that question really briefly, there isn't much research done in comparing the two that I'm aware of.
Thank you very much. someone come in here talking about how did you begin your career as an art historian?
So I did a degree at SOAS on art, and well, history first, and then I really was interested in African history in general, African art. So I thought, most of the early books on Africa are not positive. They don't really. It's not. If you're studying European art, for example, Renaissance art, let alone painting, we have books on the life of the artist. We have, text works, academic PhDs on what they ate and where they lived, what material they used. And in Africa, you don't get any of this. You still have scholars who were very they make assumption about that culture. They won't speak of it as art. In fact, most of this icon that I was showing you were considered childish. They were not respected, even the text. So what got me into art history was basically wanting to study objects that were produced during those period, which you cannot fabricate. So whereas with other things you can interpret, but with objects, we can date them. We know when the Gondar kings ruled and the period, etc. Yeah, and that's why I went into this.
Amazing. Yeah. So there's a comment here, and then one more question. The comment is the great scholar of Ethiopia, Stanislaw Choknaki, published a long paper on the iconography of St. George in Ethiopia in 1973, sadly protected by copyright, with a high license fees to get a copy. I'm sure you know that.
Yeah, so he's really actually the one that I can never pronounce his surname, and I'm not going to try. So he is, in fact, one of the most important art historians in Ethiopian art, in Ethiopian studies. In that he tried to create not write a definitive textbook. We haven't achieved that yet. That he has a famous book titled "Major Themes in Ethiopian Art," which I think is ambitious, is good. But he's the first person to take Ethiopian art very seriously, and he creates a chronology. He tries to create a typology. Yes, he worked a lot on the iconography of St. George, and his famous book titled Ethiopian Icon. If anybody can get it, it's really important in that. We have the list of these manuscripts. In terms of comparing it to other art historical books that we see in the West for India art or Middle East art, it's nowhere in comparison. But of course, he's really up there, and that's one bibliography I will recommend to anyone, because he's not assumptuous, so he doesn't sort of play down Ethiopian history or dismiss it, but he does try to document it. I think that's the word I'm thinking of. Yeah.
Dr. Penny Wixon writes, I would also like to know about the materials that were used to create the images in the manuscripts. So were the materials used to create the images in the manuscripts?
Yeah. So one of the downside of doing a talk over, like Zoom or on the computer is that you cannot see physically these manuscripts. So these manuscripts mostly measure up to 6 inches, 5 inches, 4 inches. They're huge. So they're written on parchment skin. So this is usually goat, sometimes so vellum, calf. We get stories of horses being used, but in the case of Ethiopian manuscripts, goat was quite common. So the first hagiography I showed of St. George, it's around 200 folios. So folio meaning the two skins folded together. So that's one sheep, one whole sheep to produce 2 pages technically. So 2 times 200, so you have 400. So it took a whole flock to produce one manuscript. So it's a luxurious object, and it's still it's very expensive. So skins were used, and for the color, different types of plants and minerals were used. For black, it was usually ink soot found on the pot. Again, there are good references I can give on this, and I have written an article actually on the collection of the library, which touches on the materiality used.
Again, would you be able to give that reference to the organizer of the festival?
Yes, happy to. I consent. Yes.
Good, thank you. Now you showed us the last picture. I think you showed, wasn't it? Was of the war against Italy. A question's come in here saying, "Is the depiction of St. George still a practice in contemporary art in Ethiopia?"
So one thing I wanted to mention at the start, but it was sort of scattered. This is an ongoing tradition, and this is why the restitution debate is it's very emotional for a lot of Ethiopians, especially from the church, because this tradition continues. It's not dead. That we still have scribes who are producing manuscripts. We still have artists, which is now sort of geared towards the tourist market. So we still have those scholars who want to access this material. So St. George is still prominent. Mary and him are the most depicted saint in terms of the iconography. Yes.
Right, good, thank you. Now, when we talked yesterday, I just made a little reference in my welcome to you about the sort of Christian tradition linking back to Bath to the Romans. Yesterday, you and I were talking about the even longer tradition, the royal family in Ethiopia, going back to the Queen of Sheba. Is that right? And I wonder whether I just love you to sort of come back at me and say, Nigel, our history is longer.
So, so it was only the Ethiopian monarchs who could trace 200 and something 25 generation of going back to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon, and that tradition really dates back to a manuscript that was I think the 12th century or 13th century, titled the Kibra-Negest, if I remember the date, which was, interestingly enough, translated from Coptic to Arabic then in the Ethiopian language. This was what historians have always accepted as being. And in that, it tells the story of from the Book of Kings, how the Queen of Sheba traveled to Jerusalem, met King Solomon. But in the Ethiopian version of that story, she gives birth to the first king of Ethiopia, who was King Menelik the First. But the most significant aspect of the Kibra-Negest is Ethiopia being the second Zion, or now the chosen sort of land, or chosen, one even can say even chosen people. So the significance of the Kibra-Negest is huge. And, the fact that historians argue it's a translation, not the work of Ethiopians, itself, it's another dismissal of Ethiopian history, because yes, it was translated from Coptic to Arabic, but that's the example we have now. But right. Why not from Ethiopic language is to Coptic, then to Arabic, then back to Ethiopia? It happens in Greek tradition. Why doesn't it happen in the Ethiopian tradition? So the Kibra-Negest is the most important Ethiopian book, and the British Library has one copy. One was returned to King Johannes in 1877 because it was incredibly significant, and he wanted specifically the Kibra-Negest to be returned to Ethiopia. So Ethiopia has an incredibly long legend, and again, I said at the start, when we talk about Ethiopia, we cannot constrain ourselves in the modern day border. We have to also include Nubia, we have to include Sudan, we have to include Somalia, we have to include Eritrea, Kenya. If we limit ourselves to just, to the modern sort of construction, it limits the sort of the richness of the history.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Now, there's one more question here. Where can people see your research, Eyob?
So if you follow me on Twitter and academia, I have 2 articles, one on the way on Ethiopian manuscripts, specifically My background is actually I'm working on magic at the moment, so my research is on magic. Since you're a priest, I don't want to talk about magic. So, but my focus is on Ethiopian sort of magic tradition found in manuscripts.
Well, I must say, fantastic talk. I loved your reference to, you gave the date about formal where Christianity began, but also that reference back to the 1st century. I went to South Sudan on a Christian mission about 2 or 4 years ago. Amazing trip actually down to South Sudan, but heard there this real sort of tradition of the Ethiopian eunuch and how Christianity probably came. No, they believe that was where Christianity was introduced into the Horn of Africa and then spread into that part of the African continent. So. Fascinating evening. There's one more question coming. This is very exciting. I will not want to tell you, Peter, but
we are sort of running out of time. But the interesting thing about the eunuch, I know in terms of the text, it's a very important period. But in Western art as well, he has strongly been associated with blackness. So the emphasis that the first Christian or the first person to accept Christ was black.
Right.
And this is really incredibly, I mean, for some nationalists out there might be obsessed which part of Ethiopia or Nubia or Kush that he came from. But in later iconography, especially in Italy and in other places, we get the emphasis of him being black. And I think this is historically, more accurate of his ethnicity than probably where he came from. I mean, definitely he came from that region. It's an immensely important figure in the Bible.
Well, look, I'm going to, on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much. It's been great to meet you the way we do these days over screen. If ever you come to Bath, you'd be really welcome to come and visit Bath Abbey.
Thank you.
But really, on behalf of us all tonight, thank you very much indeed, Eyob.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And sorry for the delay in starting this. Thank you, Nigel.
God bless. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.